Beyond exhibition. This is our last weekend, so a big thank you to all of you who attended and supported Petaluma's first Smithsonian exhibition. It's just been an amazing experience. I mean, just to meet the NASA scientists and astronomers. I mean, it's just been really such a neat experience for so many people, and we're so happy that see a lot of the young folks in here, and that was kind of my goal when we brought this to Petaluma, that, you know, especially with this current, you know, economic climate, you know, a lot of our educators are getting cut left and right, so anything, you know, the museum can do to help, you know, enrich our local young folks, we're very happy to do that. And so we conclude our speaker series today with the local guy, and boy, this is going to be a fun one. We've done a lot of different spins with the speaker series, and always very well attended, and I think this one's going to be a very nice one to end on. So without any further delay, we have Nolan Gasser, composer, pianist, musicologist. He's got an amazing background, and it's too much for me to remember, so I'm going to turn it over to Nolan to introduce himself. So thank you again, everyone, for your support.
Well, thank you, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed an honor to be part of this very distinguished exhibition, not least in my own hometown of Petaluma. I have great pride in that. This is, obviously, as Joe said, the last installment of the series, and not the most, perhaps, obvious one, because unlike all the very distinguished speakers before me, I am not a scientist, as I will talk about in a second. So what I'm going to be talking about today, we obviously have two computers, so we have some technical challenges, and so I'll be needing to go back and forth a little bit. But what this talk is about is really about music and how it relates to science, and specifically in connection with this exhibition, how it relates to cosmology, which is the study of the cosmos, and physics. Particle physics, astrophysics, the kinds of things that the scientists are able to take these wonderful pictures and make the wonderful discoveries that we now are learning about the origins of the universe and our relationship to it. So how music, which is of course is a type of art form, how that really can help us, help sort of enliven our understanding of it, inspire us, and just sort of do what art does, which is to be this wonderful reflection, as the title of this talk and the title of a composition of mine, how music can kind of reflect these wonderful aspects of the cosmos in this great room where we see the rings of Saturn and so forth. So, okay, so with that, it wasn't too long ago that a well-known musical bard by the name of Elvis Costello, some may know him, some may not, he said that writing and thus talking about music was a bit like dancing about architecture. You have to kind of think about that one. And if that's true, that in this talk I may waltz right into a flying buttress, because I'm going to be not only talking about music, but as I've said, talking about it as it relates to the disciplines of science, physics, and cosmology. And as I mentioned, unlike all the previous speakers, although I am trained in music, I have a PhD from Stanford in musicology, I'm a composer and pianist, I am 100% certified, untrained, at least formally, in science, therefore giving new definition to the term half-wit. But fear not this half-wit, because in my studies as a musician and in my own very intense, as my wife here can attest, self-study of science, I have learned a thing or two about how music can relate to science. And indeed, it is an enormous topic and one of great passion for me. I think by understanding the relationship of music and science, we really sort of can learn and understand how musical we are. How musical we are, because how musical the actual universe is. That's sort of a big topic, not one that we're going to totally get into, but I'll be sort of touching on certain aspects of this. But I'm actually working on a book, and one subtitle of it may be "We're All Musicians." And indeed, we all, through our brain, through what we're learning about neuroscience and about cell biology, and of course about physics and mathematics, we learn really how intrinsic music is in the cosmos. I've given many times a talk, various places, which sort of talks about music and science in a very general way. That talk is called Music, Science, and the Art of Living. And that art of living part talking about how, with our better understanding of how music relates to us as a species and to the universe as a whole, it's kind of an invitation, even a prescription for us all to take, our music listening a little bit more serious, to really get more out of life, to improve our health and all that. So this talk really narrows down, in keeping with the Smithsonian exhibition, about, obviously, about the cosmos and the wonderful things that NASA has been bringing us through the Hubble Space Telescope. And I know one of the previous speakers in this series is Lynn Kaminsky, who I was able to work with somewhat tangentially through her work with the Fermi Space Telescope, for which I've written 2 pieces of music, and I'll be talking about that. So in this talk, again, not the global picture, the more narrow picture about how music relates to physics and cosmology. And this also gives me an opportunity, or an excuse, to talk a little bit more about myself and to share with you some of my own compositions that relate music and physics, so consider yourselves forewarned. So I want to make 2 quick points before I really sort of get into it. The first is that my own sort of interest in this fusion between music and science comes, of course, out of my work as a composer, and I'll be talking about that. But it also comes out of the work that I've done in regards to a company called Pandora, which you may have heard of. I was very lucky to be one of the first employees of Pandora. It wasn't called Pandora back then, back in 2000. And I was the chief musicologist. I was sort of the only musicologist in the beginning. And I'm the architect of the Music Genome Project. And the Music Genome Project is what runs Pandora. For those of you who don't know, Pandora is internet radio. Mommy. And so my working with the Music Genome Project, of course, got me thinking a lot about the Human Genome Project and how music sort of relates to genetics and all that. So again, that's not this talk, but I know some of you may be interested in Pandora, maybe in our QA afterwards, if you have questions about it, or about that relationship between music and biology, which is a really fascinating one. Maybe I'll do in Petaluma some other time. So the second point is a bit more esoteric, and it may sort of go over the heads of some of the younger people here, but it's something that I think is important to say. When you talk about music and science, the scientifically minded among you might think, okay, well, if you're going to talk about music and physics, I want you to show me something that's verifiable, that I can really prove or disprove. And while that may be nice, I would say that in some ways that maybe that's not so necessary. When we think about what science has taught us, not only physics, but neuroscience, we now know that when we observe something in the universe, in our world around us, we're not necessarily seeing a chair or a screen as it really is. Our brains have made a model of it. And as we grow, as we learn, our model changes. In physics, there's something known as quantum mechanics, which sort of tells us the uncertainty principle. It tells us that if we're able to observe an electron circling a nucleus of an atom, if we actually look at it, we actually change it. So we can know how fast it's going, but not the direction at the same time. So if we look at its speed, we affect its direction. If we look at its direction, we affect its speed. So in other words, our engagement with the universe, with the world, changes the world. And so my point, I guess, is that when we're in the world, we sort of mirror it, we alter it, we make it make sense to us. And that's what art does, I think, par excellence. Art does, in a better way than science, is give us these metaphors for interpreting the world. So certainly it's true that we need to be verifiable and provable when we're doing science, but I think it's okay when art and science mix. We kind of help to explain the world around us to ourselves in a way that makes us think, in a way that just the data or just the raw science may not. So both things are important, and I think that will come through a little bit in this talk, and I can sort of barely see my paper, but that's okay. All right, so we're going to set the stage as soon as our IT person gets us back online here. One thing we should recognize that going back to the earliest stages of Western civilization, there have been some great minds which have discerned some pretty amazing parallels between music and the physical world. We can finally move away from Elvis Costello to this guy, the quasi-mythical figure of Pythagoras in the 6th century BC. You may know him from the Pythagorean theorem. He's a great mathematician. He also was a musician. He played the lyre and was a great dreamer and a great thinker. And what he did is he recognized the correspondence, the connection between the musical intervals. An interval is the space between two pitches. So if I sing this note and this note, that's an octave. This note and this note is a fifth. This note and this note is a fourth. Those three intervals are the most sort of prominent intervals in the music that Pythagoras was hearing and playing. They are still the most prominent, the pillars of musical structure and creation here in the West, but also in Asia, in Africa, in China. I think that if someday we discover that there's life in one of Jupiter's moons and an intelligent life, and they've made music, it'll sound weird, but it too would be based on these principal intervals. Now, why is that? Well, what Pythagoras realized, that there's a connection, a mathematical connection, between these principal intervals and principal musical proportions. Beautiful, you know, mathematicians talk about the beauty of numbers. When numbers are sort of just right and the connections are there, there's something really aesthetic about it. So what Pythagoras realized is that the proportion of 2 to 1 makes an octave. The proportion of 3 to 2 makes a fifth. The proportion of 4 to 3 makes a fourth. I can tell that you're all sort of riveted by that. Let me just explain a little bit more. If you take a string and you stretch it really tautly, really tightly, and you pluck that string, you'll hear a pitch. If you take your finger and you stop the string exactly halfway across and you pluck it again, the pitch will have risen exactly an octave. So the ratio of 2 halves to 1 half is an octave. And it's something kind of amazing about that. Not only that, the next most perfect proportion, 3 to 2, if you take a string, you divide it into 3 thirds, and you pluck it when it's open, and then you pluck it at two portions stopped, the pitch is going to rise a fifth. The next most perfect proportion of 4 to 3, again, you take that string, divide it into 4 spots, you stop it 3/4 of the way, so the proportion is 4 to 3. It'll rise from the open string to the stop string a fourth. And this is just, it couldn't be a coincidence that these 3 fundamental intervals, and they're fundamental not only because they're all important, they're kind of important in that, to our ears, in music theory, from Bach and all the theorists that we study when we're music majors, these same intervals have a sort of a hierarchy of importance based on these same proportions in that same order. Now, what difference did this make to music making? Well, in some ways it's hard to tell because we know very little about what music survived in ancient Greece. We have lots of writings about the theory about Greek music, which is very complex even for people that study music a lot. But very little musical works survive. But what we can know already from reading is when we look at the instruments, this is the lyre here, right, which was sort of the king of instruments. The way that the lyre was tuned, these open strings of the lyre, were actually affected and based on these intervals, octaves, fifths, following Pythagoras' influence. The different scales that are used and how the scales are structured by octaves, by fifths, by fourths, that too was influenced by what Pythagoras and his followers, who include Ptolemy, who of course was also a great astronomer and made some observations very key to understanding of the cosmos into the Middle Ages and beyond. So that may seem a little bit arbitrary, but if we think about the way that modern music is, so we have there an acoustic guitar and we have there a violin. The open strings are the strings that you don't put your fingers on the frets. The open strings of the guitar, E, A, D, G, B, E, are obviously very much affect the kinds of music that is played on the guitar. Whether it's classical music or bluegrass or folk music or jazz, the open strings impact the actual music that's made, whether it's written or improvised. Same thing about the violin. They're actually tuned by fifths, G, D, A, E, and that has a great impact. So we can kind of see that, okay, that these observations in physics, because that really is what Pythagoras was discerning. He didn't think about it in terms of physics, it was mathematics, but as we'll see, they're related, actually impacted music making in ancient Greece, at least in theory. And again, the strings of the lyre, the strings of the kithara were certainly affected by Pythagorean ideas about these proportions. Now, what about? Oh, actually, before I get to that, talk about this slide here. What Pythagoras, when Pythagoras made these observations about intervals and mathematics, again, he was like, "Whoa, that's pretty amazing. It's not an accident." And again, he was a dreamer. Some said he was a big drinker. And he would look at the heavens and he would say, this relationship between music and math must have a correspondence to the heavens. That the planets that circle the Earth, and of course in this period the Earth was the center of the universe, this geocentric orientation, they must all be following a sort of a musical reality and a musical logic. He called it music of the spheres. And the idea is that all of here's the Earth at the bottom, and all of the different planets, as they're going around the Earth, and the fixed stars, and the Empyrean, which is like the heavens, they all made a particular pitch which corresponded to musical scales. He actually was supposed to have been able to hear these pitches, but again, he was also supposed to be drinking a lot. But even some of his more sober successors, people like Plato and Aristotle, talked about how this must have, I can find that quote of Plato. Yes. Plato wrote that upon each circle of the cosmos stood a siren. There was this sort of mythical, beautiful lady who would be sitting up there, and she would be carried around with the movements of these different planets, uttering the concords. In other words, singing the actual pitches of a single scale. So this was something that was not just theoretical, it was really believed that there was this connection between music here on Earth and music up in the heavens. This idea really carried forward all the way into the Middle Ages and even through the Renaissance. And you have the great figure of Johannes Kepler, who was the first one to sort of demonstrate that the Earth is not the center of the universe. The Earth actually orbits around the sun. But even still, he saw this connection of proportions and intervals and the cosmos of being very, very real. He actually talked about, in this little diagram here, he sort of noticed that as the planets orbit the sun, they are at sometimes more close to the Earth, which is the perihelion, as it's called, or they're more distant from, more close to the sun, or more distant to the sun, the aphelion. And this distance he actually calculated and saw that they were like perfect ratios. So for example, Saturn is the ratio between the closest and the farthest point is 5 to 4, which is a musical interval of the major third, from F to A to F. So he imagined that as Saturn went around, he'd be doing this sort of big gliss from da. Again, he sort of imagined this was not theoretical. He imagined this really was the case. Earth, it turns out, has a relationship between the closest and the farthest of only, the ratio is 16 to 15. This actually has been verified more or less by modern calculations. Now 16 to 15 is the ratio of the half step. So from da 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 da, you can see here terra. So you can see it's just a half step there. And in kind of a marginal note here, he writes this. He says, "Telus canit mi fa mi." Mi, it says, the earth sings mi fa mi. These are the names of the notes, like as in do, re, mi, fa. Ut vel ex syllaba conjunctias in hoc nostro domicilio miseriam et famem obtinere. So the earth sings mi fa mi, so that from these syllables we can learn that on this, our home, is such misery and famine. So even making the connection between life on earth and a musical reality. Now, what influence did all this cosmology have on music making? Well, we don't really know. Again, we have very few musical works that survive. We do know, for example, that the number of strings on the lyre and on the kithara were either 7 or 8. 7 because of the 7 planets that circled the earth, as they thought: Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, the moon, and the sun. And the 8th was the fixed stars. So everything was really had kind of a musical reality to it. Now, we can actually make a more direct connection, and this is something I'll be talking about when we get into later periods. There are a few musical works that do survive where they do make an explicit, a direct connection between music and the cosmos. And there's one example of work. This is what the music looks like, and you can see this is one of the few, and it's in pretty tattered shape, written on papyrus. And this is an ode that was written an ode to the sun and to the god Apollo, who is also the patron saint of music. And I'm going to play you with my other computer here an example of what this is, a realization of what something like this may have sounded So we don't know if it actually sounded like that, but again, this gives us an example of a direct connection. So let's take a little bit stock of what we sort of talked about, what we've learned so far, that the connection between music and physics, cosmology, can take place in 2 different ways. The advances in the understanding of science, of physics, as Pythagoras showed, can have a direct relationship on the general, the language of music, by virtue of the tuning of strings, the acceptable notes that are used, and how musical works are sort of structured, even if not in the actual content of a given piece of music. And the second thing we've learned is that a musical work can directly make a connection to the cosmos by referencing it, in this case, with the text. All right, we're going to skip the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, partly because of time, but partly because there really was not a tremendous amount of advancement in the understanding of physics and cosmology through the Middle Ages and through much of the Renaissance until the very end. Where there was a connection, it was more in this regard, where there was a piece of music that had a text, but it was couched in Christian symbolism. So Ave Maria, Maris Stella, Hail Mary, Star of the Sea, which was a very popular hymn of the period. Things do become a little bit more interesting when we get into the 17th century, which is known as the Age of Reason. And here we start to see something that that sort of looks a little bit more like physics. It can be a little scary even looking at it. But the physics of sound, the physics of music starts to be studied more empirically. Sound and pitch are no longer just intervals of a string or a tube, no longer just conceived arithmetically. But now they're talked about and thought about as being vibrational frequencies, the actual frequencies of sound waves. And so the intervals between two pitches are not string length, but as relative frequencies. So for example, the relationship between the A below middle C and the A above middle C is actually now calculated through that this Mersen's law of being the distance between 220 hertz, or cycles per second, and 440 hertz, or cycles per second. So 440 to 220, it's still 2 to 1. So Pythagoras wasn't wrong, but now we start to be able to talk about it in more precise terms. It was based on this understanding that a whole bunch of other observations came forth. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but this is one that's very important. Through the 17th century, we start to get a better understanding of what is called the overtone series. The overtone series is, if I had a piano here, I could kind of demonstrate. If you sound a pitch, a low pitch on the piano, just one, like a low C on the piano, and it's really quiet. Above that pitch, in a much more silent way, a much more quiet way. So here's the low pitch. Now you can hear this pitch above it, then this one, then this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. If you have really good ears, you can hear all of these. I don't think the human ears can hear much past maybe this. But this is actually terribly interesting because, for one thing, we see that the order of the pitches that we hear above that held pitch. And we first hear the octave above, then the fifth above that, then the fourth. You can read musical notation. Then the fourth above that, then the major third above that, the minor third above that, a little bit less than a minor third above that, and then the second. So notice how it keeps getting smaller, but the order is the same as what Pythagoras taught us. The octave, the fifth, the fourth, and then it goes on to the major third, the minor third. But what else do we kind of notice by this? We notice that the pitches, now this is not more than one pitch sounding at the same time. This is one pitch sounding. So in other words, if a neutron star is going really fast, it's emitting a vibration, it's going to be doing the same thing. And if it were actually in an octave that we could hear, we would hear these same overtones. But what do they produce? If you notice it, can anyone tell me up to here what this is? If you put all the pitches together? We have any music readers here? Well, but what if you put them all together, what do we get? Anybody?
A C chord.
A C chord. You get a C major chord. Right. C, E, G. So in other words, one pitch makes a triad. One pitch makes a major chord, that C major, which is in like 97.4% of the songs we hear. If we keep on going, we actually will hear this seventh chord. But we then also hear that there are minor chords that are innate. In other words, the actual evolution of music from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, into the Baroque era, into the Classical era is one which goes from a modal orientation to tonal. What tonal means is you have major chords, you have minor chords, things were thought about as chords, and you move from one key to another. And this is the same time that physics is discovering the overtone series and frequencies. So the the point is that what physics taught us as the 17th century progressed is what indirectly, now Bach wasn't studying the law of pitch frequency, but as tonality becomes what we now hear, and most of the music we hear is tonal, it comes out of this period of music and science understanding one another.
So is that saying that just playing that single note, within that all the minor and major chords, that's the reason that those playing major and minor chords sounds pleasing?
You took the words right out of my mouth, right out of my head. That's exactly what I used. The reason, thank you very much for that point. why is this important? In other words, why is it that, not only in America or in the West, but now throughout the world, why is it that we hear major chords and minor chords and seventh chords? This B flat here, look at this, this is a C dominant seventh chord, which then has relationships to moving to the next chord, which is an F major chord. This sounds pleasing to us. We like this. We like octaves. We like fifths. We like major chords and minor chords, as opposed to, strange chords that have tritones in them, if you know what that is. Because this comes directly out of science. It comes directly out of the science of sound. So again, if there's a band jamming on Europa right now, they're going to be doing weird things, but it's going to be somewhat based on this, because their math is the same as ours. So yes, that's exactly right. And that's why our ears are tuned to it, why our brains respond to it, because it's in the cosmos. As the 17th and 18th, 19th century progressed, the math starts to get even more complicated. Here you actually have A440. So in other words, the pitch A above middle C gets fixed at A440. We have something called equal temperament, which means that every half step is the same frequency relationship. And that's important because when you listen to the music from Mozart, going into Beethoven, going into Brahms, going into Mahler, going into Wagner, from Wagner into Mahler, into Debussy, the music becomes more harmonically sophisticated. We start going from C major to F sharp major like that. I could demonstrate that on the piano more easily. Without an understanding of physics, and the piano tuners and the physicists, musicians kind of affecting the way music was constructed, if you went from C major to F sharp major like that, it would hurt. It would be so out of tune. But when you have equal temperament and all the pitches are all the same, you can go from any key to any key like that, and it's going to sound pleasing. So the relationship between physics and science affects even the way that music progressed. Now, Beethoven wasn't studying this, Wagner wasn't studying this, but he had instruments that were able to adapt to this equal temperament. All right, so any other questions? All right. Okay, so things really start to get a little bit more interesting as we move on to the 20th century. And I will be sort of racing a little bit through this because I, again, want to talk about some of my own works and then invite if there's any other questions at the end. Now, a seeming shift forward or leap forward would have taken place in the year 1916 when Gustav Holst, English composer, not a German composer, wrote this piece called The Planets, right? Perfect for this room. It would seem that, okay, at last a composer is tackling the cosmos head on. And this work, as you may know, maybe you've seen it in concert, and maybe there's been a big screen with an HD projection of Hubble telescope images of the planets, just like you're seeing here, or other space telescopes. The problem is with Holst is that he really had no interest in depicting the actual astronomical aspects of the planets. He was interested in the astrological aspects, so the astrology. So that's why Mars is called Mars, the bringer of war, and Jupiter, the bringer of jollity. So not really to do with their science, but with their astrology, going back to mythology of ancient Rome. The public doesn't seem to mind this disconnect. It's almost like Pablo Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein. It's come to look like her, and Holst's music has now come to sound like the planets. So while Holst's Warhorse may be a bit of a bust for those of us that are looking for a palpable connection, the last 50 years, so really is since 1960 or so, that music and science have come together in an unquestionable way, and where music is able to depict or reflect some discernible aspects of physics and modern cosmology. It does this in three different ways: historical, observational, or metaphorical. So, before I get into some examples, just really quickly, why would this be the case? Well, there are sort of two main reasons. One of them has to do with, over these last 50 years, there's been tremendous advances in the way that science has been used for music. You have electronics and microphones and recordings in the 1930s. You have the first sort of computer music labs in the 1960s at MIT and Bell Labs at Stanford and many, many universities around the country. You can just see how complicated with all those wires needing to be plugged in, mirroring the advances in computers generally. More recently, you have these incredible programs that those of us that have no training in sound waves and sound formation can work with these sort of digital workstations and create all kinds of incredible sounds. So physics and music have really come together just in a technical way to do things like sound processing, sound synthesis, analysis, sequencing, compositional planning, all kinds of things that humans really couldn't even do on their own. The other reason I think why we've seen these last 50 years them coming together is that physics and cosmology have become a little sexy. Maybe there's a new sexiness of physics. I mean, just look at these images, and look at the images here. They're so gorgeous, they're so aesthetic, thanks to the Hubble Space Telescope, but also through authors like Brian Greene and Stephen Hawking, who are writing books about string theory or about relativity and black holes and all these really complex scientific things for us. We don't need to know the mathematics behind relativity to get an appreciation of it. So all of this is engaging a broader public, and of course composers are part of that broader public. So, okay, so we're now in the home stretch here. To give you some examples. Again, I talked about there's 3 different ways in which music and physics and cosmology have intersected over the last 50 years. The first is the more historical approach, and where the musical discourse tells us something about the history of science. And no genre does a better job of history than opera. And so there have been recently a good number of operas where there's a physicist or two in the cast of characters. Among the most famous are Philip Glass's Einstein on the Beach and John Adams's Dr. Atomic, which is the story of the Manhattan Project and the agony that the lead physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer had to go through realizing what he had done. There's actually, I found there's like 4 operas on Einstein's life. There's one on Kepler, and I'm sure that there's going to be more and more as time goes on. To play you a little example from Philip Glass's, if you know Philip Glass's music, it's minimalist, very quite sort of consistent in its discourse. This is not really a straight story, more like little periods of Einstein's life, little vignettes. This scene I'm going to play is called the train scene, where Einstein often used the thought experiment of the train to explain the train when you're sitting on the platform and you can't tell if you're moving or the other train is moving or the platform is moving. It's to sort of explain relativity, and so this is that section here. Sounds like a train. And this character right here, that's actually Einstein himself, who you may know was a very much of a music lover. He played violin and the piano, played it all the time. He said if he wasn't a physicist, he would have been a musician. It doesn't change too much. Okay. All right. I'm sorry that I can't play for you an example of Dr. Atomic. I had it on, was going to play it on, but there's a video of it. But you can certainly go, even if you don't own this, you can just go to YouTube, type in Dr. Atomic. The scene is, John Adams quotes the poem of John Donne, Batter My Heart, to sort of express the torment of Oppenheimer, realizing what he has done. Okay, so then the second approach is the more metaphorical. And this can be abstract. So in other words, what music is doing is representing a metaphor for physics or cosmology. It can be abstract, in other words, just trying to capture a general feeling or a general mood about a concept, or it can be more concrete. In other words, where the music, by virtue of the actual structure of the music itself, tries to capture something true, something substantive related to the science. In other words, using the musical techniques, whether it's intervals or particular types of rhythms, it's not a direct correspondence. It's not like this is actually an example of a black hole or quantum mechanics or string theory. But it's using the actual elements of the science in some ways to depict what's going on, to construct what's going on in the music. So there are many examples of this. Again, in recent years, there's a piece by an American composer named Michael Gandolfi, where he wrote a piece based on the writings of Richard Feynman's Quantum Electrodynamics, or QED, again, very complicated part of physics, of quantum mechanics. There's also an opera here, Hyper Music Prologue, where the librettist, Lisa Randall, is a Harvard physicist turned librettist. The music is by a guy named Hector Perra, and this is about a girl who travels through the world of p-branes and multi-dimensions of superstring theory. So you need to sort of take your vitamins before you see that one. There's another theatrical work by Philip Glass, based on Brian Greene's children's book Icarus at the Edge of Time, about a boy who travels to a black hole. And there's a work there by an Australian composer named George Lentz, where it's an abstract piece of music, certainly metaphorical, but where each movement, so 4 movements for string quartet, is about a different celestial body. So there's one about the Pleiades, there's one about a spiral galaxy, M106, one about a nebula, and one about the Andromeda galaxy. So here's just a couple of examples. This is from, again, the Gandolfi piece, the first one. So I don't know this piece. I don't know if the musical techniques are completely abstract or if he's basing it on Feynman's theories or Feynman's... Here's an example of the hyper prologue music, a little bit more contemporary sounding. This one actually I know does have structural aspects which are related to the mathematics of string theory that the composer put in there. Too much bass. Okay, and then this is a string quartet. This is on the movement about Andromeda. Yeah, Andromeda. And I think this is just more metaphorical. He's just creating music that in some ways conjures up the image or the spirit or some aspect of the science of Andromeda, our closest galaxy. Okay, so you can see all 3 of these pieces pretty contemporary, not something you're going to go home singing. So putting aside, you know, the question of the purely aesthetic or the purely aural response to these works, are they successful pieces of music? That's really a personal, sort of response. But what about the actual purpose of them? This, I think, is a little bit more interesting. And again, there's many answers. Lisa Randall, the librettist there, what she wrote about her opera is that she's not trying to explain the physics of string theory in this work, but trying to raise consciousness about it and to explore what is meant by creativity, both in science and in art. Okay, so string theory, do we really care about this? I mean, Brian Greene has a new book about sort of multi-universes. This may be reality. And so by having a piece of music, gives us another way of thinking about it. Okay, there's a third way that this is done, and this is more observational. And given time constraints, I'm going to sort of pass over this. There's something called the allosphere. What the observational is doing is it's taking actual scientific data, actual mathematical equations, and turning them into music. So using the actual data itself to turn it into music. Another person, this is over at UC Santa Barbara, Joanne Kuchera-Morin. I spent an afternoon with her, a very amazing woman. She's built this thing at UC Santa Barbara called the allosphere, working with people in the physics department, as well as the art department, and she herself is a musician, taking all this raw data and translating it directly to music. She calls it sonification. So we're actually taking raw data and turning it into sound, into music. Another person that's doing this is someone you may know the name, not think about him in this context. That's Mickey Hart. What band does Mickey Hart play with? Jefferson. The Grateful Dead, that's it. So he's the drummer with the Grateful Dead. Happily, Mickey and I have become friends, and he's shared with me some of the work that he's done. Here is, I think I have, yeah, here's a little example of what he's actually taken from the physicist George Smoot. He's taken actual data, like the vibrations of the sun, and turned them into music. He's done it in his own way, but what you're going to hear, this is actually, he's deriving everything that you're hearing directly from scientific data. So all of those, again, are actual vibrations. I forget exactly how, but they're somehow connected to science. He got his data from the folks at SETI. If you know about SETI, that's the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And Jill Tarter, who's the director of that, sent Mickey this actual data. What you need to do in order to convert raw scientific data to something we can hear is you need to transpose it. So Mickey, for example, when he got this data, he had to translate it up 52 octaves. Because otherwise only, I don't know, whales or something could hear it. So when you translate it up 52 octaves, it's something that we can hear. That's sonification. So finally then, talk a little bit about my own efforts in this. In 2008, I was asked to write a prelude, a kind of fanfare for the launch, which is currently up circling the Earth, of what was then called GLASS, the Gamma Ray Large Area Space Telescope. It is now called Fermi, and it is searching the gamma ray sky. Gamma rays are the highest intensity portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, the same thing that is light, but only is emitted by really, really powerful sort of celestial occurrences like black holes emit them, or neutron stars. Our sun does. Happily, we're protected by our atmosphere. If a gamma ray were to hit you, you wouldn't know what hit you. So when I was first given this task of writing a prelude for this launch, I knew really nothing about any of the physics or the science related to this back in 2008. I didn't know what a gamma ray was. So I really needed to do research. And so what I really tried to do once I, again, discovered this and began to get into it, what could I do to make this science actually sort of come to life? So I do it in various ways. I'm going to play you a sample. I think it's from a section, as I mentioned, what a gamma ray is. The gamma ray is at the far end of the electromagnetic spectrum. where the far other end is radio waves, right? They can pass right through us. We don't even feel them. It's all the same thing. It's all sort of light, but it's different levels of intensity, different levels of energy. Radio waves, and then microwaves, like you heat your food, infrared, visible light, ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays. And as you go higher, it gets more intense. So what I did, this piece was written for a brass quintet, the American Brass Quintet, which has 2 trombones. A lot of quintets have tubas as their lowest instrument. The American Brass Quintet has a bass trombone. So I had the 2 trombones doing glisses in contrary motion, and that represents the actual wave, the electromagnetic the electromagnetic wave, and it gets faster and faster as it goes up. And the other 3 instruments, 2 trumpets and a French horn, are able to depict other aspects. Now, there's a video that was put to this, and unfortunately, I don't think I have the video that I could find in time. So here is just, give me a second. Just saw it here, so 1 second, please. Okay, I think this is it. Okay, so you can hear the 2 trombones, very slow and all the instruments are kind of low right now. So we're in radio waves. Now we're actually in microwaves. So the instruments are getting a little faster and a little bit higher. Now we're at infrared. Now we're visible light. Each one of these is a different color. Dangerous ones. This is ultraviolet. So the ultraviolet goes faster. Now this is X-rays. And this is gamma rays. And that last thing was a gamma ray burst, which you don't want to be in front of. Okay, so then about a year later, I was asked to write a piece for the one-year symposium of Fermi, and this was going to be a much bigger piece, actually one that would depict the entire history of the universe. And it's called Cosmic Reflection. It was premiered at the Kennedy Center in 2009. It has now been recorded by the Baltimore Symphony, and it's going to be turned into a 3D IMAX movie, so you can look forward to that. And again, what I've done here, I've done both the metaphorical, kind of like the glass prelude, actually taking some specific things. I'll go through them quickly for you, and also the historical, because we're dealing with 13.8 billion years of history in 40 minutes, which I figured out one time is like 60 million years a minute. So I'm going to play, again, a couple of examples from this. Of course, you have to have the Big Bang, which is a challenge. How do you kind of create that sort of energy? There's something called quantum fluctuations, which are these little quantum, meaning very, very small changes of energy fluctuating, and that's what gave rise to the Big Bang. That's also what gave rise to a certain instability, which caused inflation, which was this tremendous expansion of the universe. The reason why the universe looks the way it is, it's so uniform. If you look that way, you look that way, you look that way, it's pretty much the same temperature, the same shape. That's because of inflation. So this is for orchestra and narrator. And so this is the section which depicts Big Bang, the Big Bang and inflation. The narrator is Carrie Harrison, who's the son of Rex Harrison.
There is no space, there is no time. There are no atoms, planets, or stars. 13,700,000,000 years ago, the precursor of everything that now exists in our universe emerges from a single point, formless and infinitely dense, in a titanic explosion of energy we call the Big Bang.
That's where gravity separates from the other forces. So again, everything that I'm doing here, I'm trying to relate somehow to the physics, but which also makes musical sense.
As this energy erupts into its self-created space, the universe experiences an extraordinary spasm. It swells instantly at a phenomenal rate, doubling in size more than 100 times, and far less in the blink of an eye.
So again, trying out all of those glisses, I actually worked out a sort of an algorithm, my own, not based on, because the inflation, if I can find this as something you're going to want to use at cocktail parties. Yes, so when during inflation, the universe expanded by a magnitude of 10 to the 78th power in 10 to the negative 36 seconds. So, not that we know what that means, but it's pretty big in a very, very short amount of time. So obviously can't do that in real time, else no one would hear it, but trying to make it sort of that metaphor. The next section I'll play for you is the reason why we're here is because there was just a teensy bit more matter than antimatter. When matter and antimatter in the early universe met each other, they immediately annihilated. And if there had been an equal amount, a perfect equal amount, there'd be no matter. There'd be no planets, no stars, no galaxies, and of course no us. And so this is the section that depicts that.
A subtle asymmetry pervades this primal process. Equal amounts of matter and antimatter are initially produced.
So this is actually depicting that annihilation in mirror image.
Almost instantaneously, pairs of matter and antimatter particles meet and annihilate in flashes of pure energy. Yet, for each billion such destructions, one particle of matter is left over. This residual matter will ultimately produce all the galaxies, stars, planets, and us.
So always trying to combine, for me personally, the more aesthetic, the more metaphoric, the more spiritual with the science to encourage a level of How are we doing time? Well, we're sort of out. Let me just sort of go. This is a pretty good one. This is, of course, supernovas are when giant stars explode, just stars that have, a million times the mass of our sun. And when they explode, all of the elements that are inside them disperse into the space and, of course, stretch out and eventually coalesce to form other stars. Without supernovas, there would not be the more complex elements, like oxygen, like carbon, like nitrogen, the things that make up the Earth and that, of course, make up us. So this is the section which talks about supernovas.
But stars are not only born, they also die, often in terrible violence. Stars, much more massive than our sun, burn with a colossal fury and exhaust their nuclear fuel within only a few million years. At the end of their lives, in a single day, nuclear reactions rise to a roaring frenzy, converting the entire core of the star to smoldering iron. But this marks the end of the fusion process, as iron cannot burn to liberate energy. The core loses its long-standing fight against gravity, and it collapses somehow. This ignites
This next section
a
actually uses
cataclysmic explosion.
equations about supernovas.
This extraordinarily violent detonation expels the outer shell of the star into space.
That gives you an idea of that. The last section I can maybe play as we're sort of going out, sort of ties it back in to the sort of the human component into this. Again, is by virtue of these supernovas, and of course the Milky Way galaxy that came as a result of a supernova, that our sun was created, and our sort of planetary disk, which of course Earth was one, and of course the reason why we're here. So we are literally, as my piece says, we are the children of the stars and the grandchildren of the Big Bang, and that really is the thing. So music, I think, hopefully can, in many ways, give us a greater appreciation for and understanding of things that physics have taught us, and at any rate, this is my attempt to do so. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you.
Yes?
They say that the golden mean is a proportion that's everywhere in the world, and yet I never have seen it reflected in music. And I guess it's slightly less than 2/3. It's 0.618.
That's right.
5.618.
Yeah.
Have you ever experimented with that as a musical?
I personally have not experimented with the golden mean, but there are pieces of music that do. There's a piece, I forget which one, by Debussy that touches on the golden mean. I think there are other pieces, maybe by Couperin. So periodically, it's not been something that, and I think that what some theorists, music theorists have tried to do, there's a music theorist named Schenker who's tried to sort of find that golden mean. So it's almost like the golden mean is a realization of perfection. And a great piece of music, a great, prelude by Bach or something, reveals that it's that 0.6, that almost, 2/3 into the piece that we reach that climax. And I think you almost could find, there's a great term which is apotheosis. and you often find the apotheosis of a piece of music from whatever period occurs at kind of that 2/3 point. Not at the very end, but at some point.
But I would imagine that it's so close to 2/3 that it might sound just slightly off, or slightly bizarre.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a good. I mean, it is. Again, you can probably do a Google search under golden mean in music, and I'm sure you'll find some good examples. Anybody else? Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for explaining some things. I sing with a group of a cappella singers, and we use the Pythagorean tuning.
Yes.
And it's like, oh.
That's what that means.
Yeah. So, but when we do everything just right in a chord, then we have all kinds of overtones. And
That's
we can
exactly
trans those
right.
and hear those.
I know you really
And
can.
Yeah, and it's amazing. So thank you for explaining.
Well, you're very welcome. And just to sort of elaborate just a second, the move from Pythagorean tuning to what is called mean tuning to what is called equal tuning happened over the course of over a century. And some people, like Bach, for example, equal temperament was already being used in Bach's day in the 1720s and 1730s. Bach didn't like it. It took away, because not to get too technical, but what Pythagorean tuning does is it makes all the, every fifth is perfect. Every fifth is that 3-to-2 ratio. But what that means is if you keep doing a fifth, if you start from C, you go to G, you go to D, you go to A, you go to E, you go to B, you go to F sharp, C sharp. As you get further away, they become out of tune with one another. So when you actually meet at the very, you go from G sharp to D sharp to A sharp to E sharp to B sharp. So I'm getting a little technical, but B sharp is the same as C, right? But they're not the same note. They're actually, it's called the Pythagorean comma, and it's very painful to listen
Just
to.
like as a singer, we have to, like a third has to be really high.
That's exactly right. But if you're staying within a relatively local tonal center, modal center, those Pythagorean tunings are just gorgeous, and that's why Bach didn't like the equal temperament. It took the soul away. But then you can't do Wagner. You can't have the opening chord, the opening prelude of Tristan and Isolde with Pythagorean tuning. Yeah.
I have two. Do you know how many notes were in the Greek scale?
Oh, boy. Well, the Greek scale, one thing about the Greek scale is that unlike Western scales, which go from lowest to highest, Greek scales go from highest to lowest. And there were different scales. There was the greater perfect system and the lesser perfect system. And they had to do with how, what the instruments that were used and also different periods. It was something like 50-something. So it's not the full scale, or maybe 40-something. So from the highest, they all had different names, and the names kind of corresponded with, either where it is on the lute or some other aspect.
And then, not quite remembering it. It's, do you know whether they used all perfect ratios in those notes, or? Because I feel like, at least from some of my math classes, I remember that the Greeks didn't like irrational numbers.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Pythagoras obviously is the most famous, Greek thinker who. We don't actually have his writings. We have the writings of his students, his school. But there's a very famous theorist named Aristoxenus, who is probably the most sort of renowned Greek theorist. And he argues a lot with Pythagoras, and a lot of Pythagorean, especially when it comes to certain aspects of tuning. It gets much more complicated than what I talked about, but you start to get into more complicated irrational numbers. So, yeah, I have to go back and look through my notes to speak with more in depth. Anybody else? Yes.
Were you at the performance of your work?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
What's it going to say?
Well, it was very exciting, and it's going to be performed. There's many performances in the works right now, and we'll certainly spread the word. You can check out my website, nolangasser.com, to find out about that. I have a piece since we're in Sonoma County. I've been given a great honor of writing a piece for the opening concert of the new Green Music Center here in Sonoma County. So that's going to be September 29th, 2012. So mark your calendars. But that's it's no small amount of pressure. It's going to be a big deal because that hall has been celebrated as being one of the best acoustics anywhere. The same people that designed Tanglewood in Massachusetts and so forth. So that's one thing coming up. That's not related to science, though. That's related to Sonoma County. But we just play this last piece in conclusion. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Again, a great honor to be able to talk about this here in Petaluma, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.